The metal is 12 millimeters thick. At 550 meters, a standard rifle bullet punches straight through it. At 30,000 feet, an American pilot wouldn't even waste ammunition on it. But inside this cramped steel box, two men sit shoulder to shoulder, breathing air thick with gasoline fumes and engine heat, believing with absolute certainty that Japanese engineering genius will protect them. The year is 1942. The place is Guadalcanal. And in approximately 47 seconds, a single burst from an American .50 caliber machine gun will transform this Tankette from armored vehicle into execution chamber, proving what the crew has refused to believe for 7 years. Sometimes the difference between confidence and delusion is measured in millimeters of steel. This is the story of the Type 94 Tankette, Japan's most produced armored vehicle of the 1930s. But it's really about what happens when institutional pride collides with industrial reality, when strategic doctrine meets battlefield physics, when men are asked to go to war in machines that were obsolete the day they rolled off the production line, and what it reveals about the gap between what nations tell their soldiers and what those soldiers discover when theory meets enemy fire. In the summer of 1930, 6 wooden crates arrived at the Imperial Japanese Army testing grounds in Manchuria. Inside them, disassembled and packed in Cosmoline, were 6 British Carden-Loyd Mark VI Tankettes, each weighing barely 2 tons, each representing the newest fad sweeping through European military circles. The Tankette concept was seductive in its simplicity. Not quite a tank, not quite an armored car, these machines promised mobility, protection, and firepower at a fraction of the cost of proper tanks. Britain had them. France was building them. Italy was mass-producing them. And across the militaries of the world, officers were caught in the grip of what could only be called Tankette fever, the belief that these miniature armored vehicles would revolutionize modern warfare. The Japanese officers who watched those first British Tankettes crawl across the Manchurian test range saw something their nation desperately needed. Japan had entered the modern era of mechanized warfare late, playing catch-up to Western powers that had been building tanks since 1916. The nation's industrial base was limited compared to America or Britain. Steel was expensive, manufacturing capacity was stretched thin, but here was a solution that seemed almost perfect. A vehicle small enough to be affordable, simple enough to mass-produce, yet seemingly capable of providing infantry with armored support. The attraction wasn't just practical, it was ideological. Japan's military doctrine emphasized spiritual strength, tactical excellence, and making do with less. The Tankette fit perfectly into this worldview. You didn't need massive industrial might to build a Tankette. You needed cleverness, efficiency, refinement. This was something Japanese engineering could excel at, but there was a problem that those officers at the Manchurian test range either didn't see or chose not to acknowledge. The British Tankette they were examining with such enthusiasm was already being questioned in Britain itself. Tank theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart were arguing that the Tankette concept was fundamentally flawed, that armor too thin to stop rifle fire wasn't armor at all, that vehicles too small for effective weapons were mobile targets, not fighting vehicles. The Tankette fad in Europe would peak in 1932 and begin its decline by 1935, as real combat experience revealed what theory should have predicted. These tiny armored vehicles were death traps. But Japan was just getting started. The Imperial Japanese Army looked at the British and French Tankettes and made a characteristically Japanese decision. They would build their own version, but better, larger than the cramped European models, more reliable, tailored specifically to Japanese needs. In 1932, the Army Infantry School issued specifications for what they called the Tokushu Keninsha, the special tractor. The name itself reveals the conceptual confusion at the heart of the project. Was it a tractor? Was it a fighting vehicle? The answer was both, and this dual-purpose thinking would haunt every crew that ever climbed inside one. Tokyo Gas and Electric Industry, a company that would later become Hino Motors, received the contract in 1933. The design brief seemed straightforward enough. Create a tracked vehicle that could carry supplies to frontline troops, traverse rough terrain, provide protection against small arms fire, and when necessary, support infantry attacks with mounted machine gun fire. Keep it simple. Keep it cheap. Make it reliable. In 1934, the first prototype was completed and sent to Manchuria for testing. The vehicle that emerged from Tokyo Gas and Electric's workshops was, in many ways, a marvel of efficient design given the constraints. Just over 3 meters long, barely 6 meters wide, weighing 3,400 kilograms, the Type 94 was small enough to move through terrain that would stop larger vehicles, light enough to cross bridges that couldn't support heavier tanks, simple enough that field maintenance could be performed with basic tools. The armor ranged from 6 millimeters at the thinnest points to 12 millimeters at the front, supposedly thick enough to stop rifle fire. An air-cooled 35 horsepower engine, wrapped in asbestos insulation to protect the crew from its heat, could push the Tankette to 40 kilometers per hour on roads, 25 kilometers per hour cross-country. The suspension was a clever piece of engineering, using bell cranks and horizontal compression springs that converted vertical movement into horizontal motion, creating a smooth ride over rough terrain. It was a system that Japanese engineers were proud of, one they would use in larger tanks throughout the war. The crew of 2 sat in cramped intimacy. The driver positioned to the right of the front-mounted engine, the commander squeezed into a tiny, manually rotating turret at the rear, armed with either a 5mm Type 91 machine gun, or later a 7mm Type 92. The turret was so small, so light, that no mechanical traverse was installed. The gunner had to physically push the turret around by hand. At the rear of the hull, a large door allowed access to a storage compartment. The Tankette could tow a tracked trailer, fulfilling its original purpose as a supply carrier. On paper, it all made sense. In the controlled environment of the Manchurian testing grounds in 1934, it performed admirably. The Army standardized the design as the Type 94 Tankette in 1935 and immediately ordered mass production. The unit cost was roughly 50,000 yen, about half the price of a Type 95 light tank, a quarter the cost of a Type 89 medium tank. For a nation with limited industrial resources, this seemed like brilliant efficiency. You could field 4 Type 94s for the price of 1 proper tank. The Army's plan was to attach Tankette companies to infantry divisions, providing each division with mobile firepower without the expense of true armor. It was economical. It was practical. It was, the Army believed, a perfect solution tailored to Japan's specific needs and limitations. Production began immediately. 300 units in 1935, 246 in 1936, 200 in 1937, 70 in 1938, small runs of 5 and 2 in 1939 and 1940 as production shifted to the improved Type 97 Tankette. In total, 823 Type 94 Tankettes were built, making it the most numerous Japanese armored vehicle of its generation, more common in service than any tank the nation produced before 1941. These Tankettes were organized into independent Tankette companies, typically consisting of 16 vehicles and 118 men, divided into 4 platoons of 4 Tankettes each. Later, the organization shifted to 6 Tankettes per infantry division. They were deployed wherever Japanese forces operated: Manchuria, Mongolia, the length and breadth of China from Hebei to Shanghai. They would later spread across the Pacific, from Burma to the Philippines, from Java to Guadalcanal, from the Dutch East Indies to countless small islands whose names most Japanese had never heard before the war. And everywhere they went, their crews discovered the same terrible truth. The Type 94 Tankette had been designed for a war that didn't exist. It had been optimized for conditions that would never occur. And the assumptions built into its design, the confident calculations about what thickness of armor was sufficient, what caliber of weapon was adequate, what level of protection was acceptable, all of these assumptions were catastrophically wrong. But that realization came slowly, battle by battle, death by death, as the gap between doctrine and reality was measured in the bodies of young men who climbed into these steel coffins, believing their nation's assurances that they were adequately protected. The Type 94's first real test came in China, and at first it seemed to validate every assumption the Imperial Japanese Army had made. When Japanese forces pushed into China in 1937, they found an enemy that was poorly equipped to deal with any kind of armored vehicle. The Chinese National Revolutionary Army possessed exactly 3 tank battalions in the entire country. These were equipped with a hodgepodge of obsolete equipment, some old British export models, Italian CV-33 Tankettes, even smaller and more poorly armed than Japan's, a handful of French Renault tanks dating back to World War I. Against this opposition, the Type 94 seemed unstoppable. Chinese infantry armed with rifles and machine guns watched these small steel boxes advance and found their bullets bouncing off armor that, while thin, was thick enough to defeat standard rifle ammunition. The psychological impact was devastating. Troops who had never faced armored vehicles before broke and ran at the sight of tankettes advancing with machine guns chattering. Japanese commanders filed glowing reports. The Type 94 was performing brilliantly. It was providing exactly the kind of mobile firepower and psychological shock that doctrine predicted. It could dash forward to support infantry attacks, suppress enemy positions with machine gun fire, and withdraw before effective counterfire could be organized. It was fast enough for reconnaissance, reliable enough for long-range operations, numerous enough to be deployed wherever needed. In the vast expanses of China, operating against an enemy with virtually no anti-tank capabilities, the Type 94 crews developed a dangerous sense of confidence. This confidence was built on real experience. These men weren't fools. They were seeing with their own eyes that their vehicle could do what it was designed to do. They were surviving battles. They were achieving objectives. The Tankette was working. But they were learning the wrong lessons because they were fighting the wrong war. The first hint that something was fundamentally wrong came in 1939 at a place most Japanese had never heard of. Nomonhan, called Khalkhin Gol by the Soviets, was a disputed stretch of grassland on the border between Japanese-controlled Manchukuo and Soviet-backed Mongolia. It was remote, strategically unimportant, the kind of place where border skirmishes should have remained just that, minor incidents resolved through negotiation. But in May 1939, what started as a minor border clash escalated into a full-scale undeclared war involving tens of thousands of troops, hundreds of tanks, and aircraft. For the Japanese military, Nomonhan would become a nightmare that revealed every flaw in their doctrine, equipment, and training. And for the crews of Type 94 Tankettes, it was the place where comfortable assumptions met Soviet reality. The Japanese committed the 3rd and 4th Tank Regiments to Nomonhan, a force that included Type 89 medium tanks, Type 95 light tanks, and a number of Type 94 Tankettes. These were experienced units, veterans of combat in China, confident in their equipment and training. What they encountered shattered that confidence completely. The Soviet forces at Nomonhan were equipped with BT-5 and BT-7 cruiser tanks, fast vehicles armed with high-velocity 45mm guns. These were not the poorly equipped Chinese infantry the Japanese had been fighting. These were combined arms forces with proper tanks, artillery support, air cover, and modern anti-tank weapons. The Japanese tank doctrine, which emphasized individual valor and infantry support over combined arms coordination, proved catastrophically inadequate. The Type 94 Tankettes suffered especially horrific losses. Their 12mm of armor, adequate against rifle fire, was meaningless against the Soviet 45mm gun. At any range, at any angle, a single hit would penetrate completely, turning the interior of the Tankette into a storm of molten metal and spalling fragments. The crews never had a chance. They would see the muzzle flash of a Soviet tank gun and have perhaps half a second before impact. Not enough time to take evasive action, not enough time to return fire, barely enough time to understand they were about to die. The survivors of Nomonhan returned to Manchuria with stories that the High Command didn't want to hear. They described Soviet tanks that could destroy Type 94s at ranges where the Tankette's machine gun was completely ineffective. They talked about Japanese tanks burning, crews trapped inside metal coffins as ammunition cooked off, and fuel tanks exploded. They reported that their carefully rehearsed tactics, which had worked so well in China, were suicide against a modern mechanized enemy. Some Japanese tankers resorted to desperate measures, attacking Soviet tanks with explosives and Molotov cocktails because their main guns couldn't penetrate Soviet armor and their machine guns were useless. These were the actions of brave men in inadequate equipment, infantrymen in steel boxes, not tank crews in fighting vehicles. The Japanese army's response to Nomonhan was complex and ultimately damaging. At the tactical level, some lessons were learned. Tank infantry coordination needed improvement. Combined arms operations required better training. The Type 97 medium tank with its better gun needed to be prioritized in production. But at the institutional level, something more troubling happened. Many infantry officers blamed the defeat on the tankers themselves, claiming they had retreated while the infantry fought on, ignoring the fact that the tank units had been massacred. The idea took hold that Japanese tanks were inherently inferior, that mechanized warfare wasn't suited to Japanese strengths, that the future lay in infantry tactics, not armored operations. This was exactly the wrong lesson to draw. The problem wasn't that tanks were ineffective. The problem was that Japanese tanks were inadequate and doctrine was flawed. But rather than acknowledge these fundamental issues and undertake the massive industrial and doctrinal changes necessary to compete with Soviet and eventually American armor, the Army doubled down on infantry primacy. The Type 94 Tankette continued in production until 1940. Hundreds remained in service when Japan entered the Pacific War. And the crews who would climb into these vehicles in 1941 and 1942 would pay the price for institutional denial and wishful thinking. December 1941. Japan launched its stunning offensive across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and in those early heady days of conquest, when Japanese forces seemed unstoppable, the Type 94 Tankette once again appeared to validate its design. In Malaya, Type 94s were part of the tank detachment that spearheaded General Yamashita's drive down the peninsula towards Singapore. Operating against British forces that were unprepared for mechanized warfare, lacking adequate anti-tank weapons, and poorly coordinated, the Japanese tankettes were terrifyingly effective. Lieutenant Colonel Seki's detachment, which included approximately 50 Type 94 tankettes, raced ahead of the main force, creating panic and confusion. At the Battle of the Slim River, Japanese tanks, including Type 94s, achieved a breakthrough that captured a crucial bridge and opened the route to the rest of Malaya. The British, who had never trained to fight against armor in jungle conditions, found themselves overrun by an enemy that used terrain and speed to devastating effect. In the Philippines, Type 94 tankettes supported Japanese infantry as they fought their way down Bataan. In the Dutch East Indies, 8 Type 94 tankettes of the 56th Infantry Group Tankette Unit, also called the Anai Tankette Unit after their commander, had a notable role in the conquest of Java. On March 2, 1942, these 8 tiny tankettes engaged and routed a large enemy force, captured a bridge intact, and at dawn overran a position defended by 600 enemy soldiers. Within days, the Dutch forces in the area had surrendered. It was another stunning success story, the kind that fills after-action reports with phrases like highly effective and exceeded expectations. But these victories were deceptive. The Type 94 wasn't succeeding because it was a good design. It was succeeding because it was facing enemies who were unprepared, poorly equipped, or already collapsing. The moment Japanese tankettes encountered properly equipped and determined resistance, the illusion shattered. On Guadalcanal in late 1942, a small number of Japanese tanks, including Type 94 tankettes, were landed to support infantry attacks against American positions. The results were catastrophic. American forces were equipped with 37mm anti-tank guns, weapons that could easily penetrate any armor the Japanese possessed. At the Battle of the Matanikau River, Japanese tanks attempting to cross were systematically destroyed by American anti-tank fire. The tankettes never had a chance. The 37mm gun could penetrate the Type 94's armor at over 1,000 meters. The tankette's machine gun could barely scratch American positions at 300 meters. It wasn't combat. It was target practice. The psychological impact on the crews was devastating. These men had been told their armor would protect them, that their vehicle was a fearsome weapon, that Japanese engineering excellence had created a machine suited to their needs. Now they were climbing into metal boxes, knowing that the moment they were spotted, they would be destroyed. Some crews chose to dig their tankettes into defensive positions, using them as stationary pillboxes rather than mobile fighting vehicles. At least that way they might survive longer than the few seconds it took an American anti-tank round to cover the distance from gun to target. By 1943, the Type 94 tankette was obsolete, even by Japanese standards. The Type 97 tankette with its 37mm gun was better armed, though still inadequately armored. Larger tanks like the Type 97 Chi-Ha offered more protection and firepower, but hundreds of Type 94s remained in service because Japan's industrial capacity couldn't produce enough modern tanks to replace them. And so crews continued to climb into these death traps, continued to go into battle in vehicles that everyone now understood were inadequate because there was nothing else available. Inside a Type 94 Tankette, the experience was one of claustrophobic terror, punctuated by moments of stark realization. The interior was cramped beyond what modern observers can easily imagine. The driver sat immediately next to a 35-horsepower engine wrapped in asbestos, feeling its heat through his uniform despite the insulation, breathing fumes that leaked around imperfect seals. The commander behind him was wedged into a turret so small that he could barely move, manually rotating the entire turret by pushing with his hands because there wasn't room or weight allowance for a mechanical traverse. Together they occupied a space roughly the size of a modern car's interior, except this space was filled with engine, transmission, ammunition, fuel tank, weapons, and steel armor that in direct sunlight would heat the interior to temperatures approaching 50 degrees Celsius. The noise was overwhelming. The engine, running at high RPM, created a mechanical scream that made communication between the two crew members nearly impossible without shouting directly into each other's ears. When the machine gun fired, the concussion inside the turret was physically painful. When the Tankette was hit by enemy fire, the sound was indescribable, a metallic shriek that warned of penetration and death. But the worst part, the thing that haunted survivors of Tankette service, was the knowledge. By 1943, everyone knew. The armor wouldn't stop a .50 caliber bullet at range. It wouldn't stop anti-tank rifle fire. It certainly wouldn't stop an anti-tank gun or tank round. The men climbing into these vehicles weren't naive recruits. They were experienced soldiers who understood exactly what they were getting into. They knew that if an American Sherman tank spotted them, they were dead. They knew that if they encountered a Soviet T-34, they were dead. They knew that even infantry with proper anti-tank weapons could destroy them easily. And yet they climbed in anyway, because orders were orders, because duty was duty, because to refuse would bring shame on themselves and their families, because this was the machine they had been given, and this was the war they had been ordered to fight. Think about what that does to a person's psychology. Imagine being 22 years old, sitting in a metal box that you know for certain won't protect you, advancing toward an enemy position that you know is equipped with weapons that will kill you the moment you're spotted. Doing this not because you believe in the mission, but because refusal is unthinkable. That's the psychological reality of the Type 94 Tankette crew in the later war years. These men weren't fighting with confidence in their equipment. They were performing a kind of mobile sacrifice, carrying out orders in machines everyone understood were obsolete. Some developed fatalistic attitudes, convincing themselves that death was inevitable and that all that mattered was dying well. Others simply numbed themselves to the reality, focusing on technical tasks and immediate surroundings rather than thinking about what would happen in the next combat engagement. And some, though they would never admit it openly, quietly understood that they had been betrayed by their own military establishment, sent to fight in equipment that was inadequate, not because Japan couldn't build better, but because institutional inertia, resource misallocation, and doctrinal rigidity had prioritized other things. The gap between what soldiers were told about their equipment and what they experienced in combat created a form of cognitive dissonance that some never resolved. You were trained to believe that Japanese engineering was excellent, that your superiors would equip you properly, that the nation would not send you into battle in defective machines. But the evidence of your own experience contradicted all of that. The Type 94 was not a good tank. It was barely adequate in 1935. By 1943, it was a death trap. And yet the official line never changed. The problem was always tactical, never systemic. The issue was always execution, never design. The responsibility fell on the soldiers, never on the institution that equipped them. The Type 94's vulnerabilities weren't limited to enemy action. The vehicles suffered from chronic mechanical problems that grew worse as the war progressed and maintenance standards declined. In combat service, the Type 94 had a tendency to throw its tracks during high-speed turns, a potentially fatal problem when you're maneuvering under fire. Japanese engineers recognized this and in 1937 redesigned the suspension with a larger idler wheel in ground contact, extending the chassis to 35 meters. It helped, but didn't completely solve the problem. Later model Type 94s were more reliable, but by then production was ending, and the accumulated fleet of early models continued in service with their original flaws. The engine, while generally reliable in temperate climates, struggled in extreme conditions. In the scorching heat of the Pacific Islands, cooling became a critical issue. The air-cooled engine depended on airflow, but when operating at low speeds in thick jungle, insufficient cooling led to overheating and mechanical failures. In the bitter cold of Manchuria and northern China, the reverse problem occurred. The engine required extensive preheating before it could be started, a time-consuming and dangerous process that could leave crews vulnerable to enemy fire. Fuel consumption was higher than theoretical calculations predicted, especially in combat conditions with constant maneuvering. Range, listed as adequate in specifications, proved problematic in actual operations where supply lines were stretched and fuel availability uncertain. The Type 94's small fuel tank meant frequent refueling, and every refueling stop was a vulnerability. The machine gun armament, while theoretically capable of suppressing infantry, proved inadequate in practice. The early 6 5mm Type 91 machine gun lacked stopping power. Even the later 7mm Type 92 was marginal against prepared positions. Against any kind of fortification or hardened cover, the Tankette's armament was useless. Crews found themselves in situations where they could see the enemy clearly, could maneuver into firing position, but couldn't effectively engage because their weapons simply couldn't penetrate enemy defenses. The ammunition load was another problem. The Tankette could carry approximately 1,780 rounds for its machine gun, which sounds like a lot until you consider the rate of fire and the duration of typical engagements. In sustained combat, ammunition could be expended in minutes, leaving the Tankette effectively unarmed. Resupply required the vehicle to withdraw from combat, often under fire, to rendezvous with supply vehicles that might be kilometers away or might not exist at all if logistics had broken down. And by 1944, Japanese logistics in the Pacific were collapsing under American pressure. The vision problem was acute. The driver's vision was limited to narrow slits in the armor. The commander in the turret had somewhat better visibility, but only when his head was exposed above the turret rim, which meant choosing between seeing the battlefield and being protected by armor. In combat, tankers had to make split-second decisions about whether to button up and be blind, or expose themselves to observe. Many chose exposure, understanding that being blind in combat was more dangerous than the risk of small arms fire. But that meant the armor, the entire reason the Tankette existed, was often not protecting the most vulnerable crew member, because effective employment of the vehicle required him to give up that protection. The maintenance burden was substantial. While the Type 94 was designed for simplicity and reliability, operating in combat conditions meant constant wear, frequent breakdowns, and ongoing maintenance needs. But as the war progressed and Japanese supply chains deteriorated, spare parts became scarce, qualified mechanics were killed or reassigned, and field maintenance became increasingly improvised. Tankettes that broke down were often cannibalized to keep others running. By 1944 and 1945, many Type 94s in service were barely functional, held together by improvisation and the desperate skill of crews who understood that this inadequate machine was better than no machine at all. The most damning evidence of the Type 94's inadequacy comes from understanding what it was up against. When American forces entered the Pacific War, they brought with them the M3 Stuart light tank, a vehicle that weighed 12.7 tons, had armor up to 44 millimeters thick, mounted a 37 millimeter gun, and had a top speed of 58 kilometers per hour. The Stuart wasn't even considered a front-line tank by American standards. It was a light tank, relegated to reconnaissance and infantry support, because it was inadequate against German armor in Europe. But against Japanese tankettes, the Stuart was a monster. A Stuart could destroy a Type 94 at ranges where the Tankette couldn't even reach the Stuart with machine gun fire. The Stuart's armor was thick enough that the Type 94's machine gun was completely useless against it. In a one-on-one encounter, the Type 94 had zero chance of survival. Zero. Not a small chance. Not a theoretical possibility if everything went right. Zero. The best a Type 94 crew could hope for was to run away and hide, because engaging meant certain death. Later, when American M4 Sherman medium tanks arrived in the Pacific, the mismatch became even more absurd. The Sherman weighed 30 tons, had armor up to 76 millimeters thick, mounted a 75 millimeter gun, and could be equipped with multiple machine guns. A Sherman could destroy multiple Type 94s without breaking stride. And the Sherman crews knew it. There are photographs from late in the war showing destroyed Japanese tankettes that American troops barely considered worth photographing. These tiny vehicles were curiosities, museum pieces, reminders of how far behind Japanese armor design had fallen. Soviet armor was even more dominant. The T-34 medium tank, which the Soviets began deploying in 1940, was arguably the best tank design of the war. It had sloped armor that was effectively much thicker than its nominal measurement, a high-velocity 76 millimeter gun, wide tracks that gave excellent mobility, and was produced in staggering numbers. A Type 94 tankette encountering a T-34 was an ant encountering a boot. The engagement would be over before the tankette crew understood they were in combat. Even against theoretically comparable opponents, the Type 94 was outclassed. British and Australian forces in the Pacific had access to vehicles like the Universal Carrier, which, while unarmored in the same class as tankettes, had better mobility and could be equipped with more effective weapons. The Type 94 wasn't just inadequate, it was obsolete by the standards of 1935, let alone 1943. But here's what makes the Type 94 story truly tragic. Japan could have done better. The nation had skilled engineers, dedicated workers, and industrial capacity that, while limited compared to America, was sufficient to produce adequate armored vehicles if properly organized and prioritized. The Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tank, introduced in 1938, was a reasonable design by the standards of its time. Not as good as German or Soviet tanks, but not embarrassingly inadequate either. If Japan had focused its limited armor production on vehicles like the Chi-Ha, phased out obsolete designs like the Type 94, and developed doctrine that used armor effectively in combined arms operations, Japanese tank forces could have been respectable if not dominant. But that didn't happen. Instead, Japan produced 823 Type 94 tankettes, hundreds of Type 97 tankettes that were only marginally better, and insufficient numbers of heavier tanks. The nation continued deploying tankettes long after their obsolescence was obvious, because institutional inertia was stronger than tactical reality. The Army's response to the lessons of Nomonhan was to restrict mechanized operations and emphasize infantry tactics, rather than acknowledge that the problem was inadequate equipment and doctrine. This wasn't incompetence. It was something more complex and more troubling. It was a system that couldn't admit error, couldn't acknowledge failure, couldn't change course even when the evidence of failure was written in the casualties of every engagement. The Type 94 tankette continued in service not because anyone thought it was adequate, but because admitting it was inadequate meant admitting that years of production, training, and doctrine had been wasted, that the institutional assumptions were wrong, that the confident predictions had been false. And institutions, even more than individuals, struggle to admit they've been fundamentally wrong. In the final years of the war, surviving Type 94 tankettes were often used as static defensive positions. They would be dug into prepared emplacements, buried in sandbags and earth until only the turret was exposed, creating a kind of armored pillbox. In this role, immobile and hull down, the Type 94 was actually somewhat effective. The limited armor was less of a liability when the vehicle was reinforced with earthworks. The machine gun, while inadequate for offensive operations, could suppress infantry and defend approaches. This was probably the most effective use of the Type 94 in the late war period, which tells you everything about the vehicle's inadequacy as a mobile fighting platform. It worked best when it couldn't move. Some crews, ordered to conduct suicide charges or impossible missions, simply chose to dig in rather than carry out orders that were certain death. This wasn't cowardice. It was a rational response to impossible situations by men who understood that mobile operations in a Type 94 against American forces was suicide. But defending a prepared position at least gave them a chance to survive and inflict casualties. The institutional response to this was predictable. Commanders who had never sat in a Tankette, who had never felt the terror of being in a vehicle you knew was inadequate, blamed the tank crews for lack of fighting spirit. The narrative became that Japanese tankers were insufficiently aggressive, that they lacked the proper offensive mindset, that the problem was morale, not equipment. This was the same logic that blamed the Nomonhan defeat on tanker cowardice rather than doctrinal and material inadequacy. It was a comfortable lie that allowed the institution to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. By 1945, most surviving Type 94 tankettes were in static defensive positions on islands or in China. They were no longer mobile forces. They were bunkers that had once been vehicles, manned by crews who understood perfectly well that if American or Soviet forces attacked, their survival depended on factors that had nothing to do with the machine they occupied. The Type 94's final appearances in combat were pathetic rather than glorious. At Okinawa, several Type 94s were captured intact by American forces, who photographed them with a mixture of curiosity and pity. These tiny vehicles, smaller than many American trucks, armed with a single machine gun protected by armor that couldn't stop a .50 caliber round, represented the gap between Japanese aspirations and capabilities. American military intelligence analysts examining captured Type 94s were struck by how obsolete the design was. These were vehicles that would have been marginal in 1935. In 1945, they were relics. Some American veterans recall encountering Type 94 tankettes and initially being unsure what they were looking at. Were they children's toys? Training vehicles? It took a moment to realize that these tiny machines were actual frontline combat vehicles that Japanese crews had been ordered to fight in. The psychological impact on American troops was complex. On one hand, it reinforced the perception of Japanese technological inferiority and the righteousness of the Allied cause. On the other hand, some veterans felt a profound sadness for the Japanese crews who had been sent into battle in these death traps. Men who had fought and died, not because their equipment was adequate, but because refusal was impossible. After the war, a few Type 94 tankettes survived in museums or as war souvenirs. The Australian War Memorial has one captured on Borneo, its camouflage paint still showing scratches, where Australian soldiers carved their initials and service numbers into the armor. These inscriptions are a kind of epitaph, evidence that real men fought and died in these machines, that what looks in retrospect like an obvious failure was experienced by human beings who had no choice but to climb inside and do their duty. The Type 94 tankette story is ultimately a story about the gap between institutional certainty and battlefield reality, between what nations tell their soldiers and what those soldiers discover when theory confronts enemy fire. In 1935, when the Type 94 entered service, Japanese military planners were certain they had created an efficient, cost-effective solution to the challenge of providing infantry with armored support. They had data supporting this certainty. They had successful tests in Manchuria. They had doctrine that explained how the vehicle would be employed. They had confidence in Japanese engineering excellence and martial spirit. All of that certainty was built on assumptions that collapsed under combat conditions. The assumption that 12 millimeters of armor was sufficient was wrong. The assumption that a machine gun was adequate armament was wrong. The assumption that cramming 2 men into a 3-meter-long box was acceptable was wrong. The assumption that speed and mobility could compensate for inadequate protection was wrong. The assumption that Japanese forces would face only poorly equipped opponents was catastrophically wrong. But institutions don't easily admit they're wrong. Admitting the Type 94 was inadequate meant admitting that the entire tankette concept was flawed, that years of production had been wasted, that the limited industrial resources devoted to building 823 tankettes should have been spent on fewer but better vehicles. It meant acknowledging that soldiers had died in equipment that was obsolete from the beginning, and so the official line never changed. The Type 94 was described as suitable for its purpose, effective in China, adequate for reconnaissance and infantry support. The problem, according to official narratives, was never the vehicle. It was tactics, or crew training, or fighting spirit, or enemy superiority in numbers. Anything except the fundamental truth that the machine was wrong from its conception. This is how institutions preserve themselves in the face of failure. They externalize blame. They reframe disaster as isolated incidents rather than systemic problems. They maintain public confidence in doctrines and equipment long after private doubts have become certainties. The soldiers who suffered the consequences of this institutional self-deception were caught in an impossible position. They couldn't publicly question the adequacy of their equipment without seeming to lack fighting spirit or criticize the wisdom of their superiors. They couldn't refuse to fight in inadequate vehicles without bringing shame on themselves and their families. They couldn't point out the obvious fact that the Type 94 Tankette was a death trap without implicitly criticizing an institutional structure that didn't permit such criticism from below. And so they climbed into these steel coffins and did their duty. Knowing the machine was inadequate, knowing the odds of survival were poor, knowing that somewhere up the chain of command were men who also knew these things, but who prioritized institutional face-saving over soldier survival. What does that do to a person's relationship with truth? If you spend years fighting in a vehicle you know is inadequate, while your commanders insist it's fine. If you watch friends die in machines that should never have been in combat, while official reports describe successful operations, if you experience firsthand the gap between propaganda and reality, between what you're told and what you know, how does that shape your understanding of institutional honesty? Some soldiers became cynics, privately mocking the discrepancy between official narratives and their lived experience, while publicly maintaining proper attitudes. Some developed a fatalistic acceptance that truth didn't matter, that survival was luck and death was random, that all you could do was perform your duty and hope. Some simply broke, psychologically unable to reconcile the contradictions between what they were ordered to believe and what they experienced. And some, after the war, became determined to tell the truth about what they'd experienced, to ensure that history recorded not the official sanitized version, but the reality of fighting in inadequate equipment against overwhelming odds. The Type 94 Tankette lasted in service from 1935 to 1945, a decade in which armored warfare evolved from its infancy to devastating maturity. In 1935, when the first Type 94s rolled off production lines, the concept of the Tankette was still viable in military circles worldwide. By 1945, when the last surviving Type 94s were being dug into defensive positions or captured by advancing Allied forces, the entire concept had been thoroughly discredited by battlefield experience. The decade between saw a revolution in armor design. Tanks grew heavier, more powerfully armed, better protected. Doctrine evolved to emphasize combined arms operations, mechanized warfare, breakthrough, and exploitation. Anti-tank weapons became ubiquitous and deadly. The battlefield became increasingly lethal for any vehicle with inadequate protection. The Type 94 didn't evolve with these changes because it couldn't. Its fundamental design was frozen in 1934 assumptions. Its armor thickness, weapon caliber, engine power, and crew space were all determined by calculations made before modern tank warfare had really been tested. And once in production, once deployed in numbers, once integrated into organizational tables and training programs, changing it became institutionally and practically difficult. Japan did produce the Type 97 Tankette as a successor, with better armament and slightly improved armor. But the Type 97 was still fundamentally inadequate by the standards of 1940s warfare. The problem wasn't incremental, it was categorical. The entire Tankette concept was wrong for modern mechanized combat, and Japan, with limited industrial resources and doctrinal rigidity, never fully acknowledged this and shifted production to adequate vehicles in sufficient numbers. Compare this to other nations that recognized their mistakes and changed course. Britain produced Tankettes in the 1930s, realized they were inadequate, and phased them out in favor of proper tanks and universal carriers used in appropriate roles. The Soviet Union built thousands of light tanks in the 1930s, discovered in Finland and early operations against Germany that they were obsolete, and ruthlessly shifted production to T-34s and other effective designs. America, entering the war later, had the luxury of learning from others' mistakes and produced vehicles that, while not perfect, were adequate for the threats they faced. Japan continued producing and deploying tankettes years after their obsolescence should have been obvious, not because Japanese engineers couldn't design better vehicles, but because institutional and industrial constraints made change difficult and admitting past mistakes painful. The crews who paid the price for this institutional failure had no power to change the system that sent them into battle in inadequate machines. They could only perform their duty as best they could with what they were given, knowing that what they'd been given was insufficient, hoping that skill and luck might compensate for inadequate steel and firepower. Most of them didn't survive. Those who did carried with them the knowledge of how thin the margin between confidence and delusion can be, how dangerous institutional certainty becomes when it's disconnected from reality, how men can be asked to die not for victory, but to preserve the fiction that previous decisions were correct. This is the real lesson of the Type 94 Tankette, not that Japan built a bad vehicle, though it did, not that Japanese engineers were incompetent, because they weren't. The lesson is about what happens when institutions can't admit error, when doctrinal commitment overrides tactical reality, when the psychological comfort of certainty becomes more important than the physical survival of soldiers. Every nation that fought in World War II made equipment decisions that proved wrong. Every military deployed vehicles and weapons that turned out to be inadequate. The difference was in how they responded. Did they acknowledge the problem and change? Or did they double down on failed concepts and blame soldiers for the resulting casualties? Japan, trapped by limited industrial resources, cultural factors that made admitting error difficult, and institutional structures that prioritized harmony over truth, chose the latter path. The Type 94 Tankette became a symbol of that choice, and the men who crewed it became casualties not just of enemy action, but of institutional inflexibility. Consider the psychological weight of that reality. You're a 22-year-old tank crewman in 1943. You've survived several battles. You've seen friends die when their tankettes were destroyed by weapons they couldn't defend against. You know with absolute certainty that your vehicle is inadequate. But you can't say that openly. You can't refuse to fight. You can't even privately admit to yourself that your nation has failed you, because admitting that undermines everything you've been taught about duty, honor, and loyalty. And so you climb into the tankette again. You advance toward another enemy position. You perform your duty knowing the odds are against you. Not because you believe it will work, but because the alternative, acknowledging that it's all futile, is psychologically unbearable. This is the human cost of institutional failure to confront truth. It's not measured only in casualties, though those are horrific enough. It's measured in the psychological burden placed on soldiers who must perform impossible tasks in inadequate equipment while maintaining the fiction that everything is fine. The Type 94 Tankette represents a particular kind of military failure, one where the problem isn't a lack of courage or skill on the part of soldiers, but a failure of institutional honesty and adaptability. The crews weren't inadequate. The leadership training wasn't insufficient. The tactical employment wasn't necessarily wrong. The machine itself was the problem, and everyone who climbed inside one after 1939 knew it. But knowing doesn't change anything when you're part of a system that can't acknowledge what everyone knows. As the war entered its final year, the surviving Type 94 tankettes were distributed across the shrinking Japanese empire. Some were in China, where they'd been since the 1930s, now old and worn, maintained by increasingly desperate mechanics with diminishing spare parts. Some were on Pacific islands, dug into defensive positions, waiting for American invasions that would sweep over them like tsunamis. Some were in Manchuria, theoretically guarding against Soviet attack, though everyone understood that if the Soviets came, these thin-skinned relics would be crushed in hours. The crews manning these positions knew they were in obsolete equipment. They knew the coming battles would be one-sided massacres. But they performed their duties because that's what soldiers do, because giving up wasn't an option their culture and training permitted, because even futile resistance felt better than surrender. When Soviet forces invaded Manchuria in August 1945, Type 94 tankettes were among the Japanese armor that attempted to resist. The result was predictable. Soviet T-34s and IS-2 heavy tanks crushed Japanese defensive positions in a devastating offensive that showcased exactly how far behind Japanese armor had fallen. The Type 94 crews fought and died in machines that were obsolete a decade earlier, facing an enemy equipped with some of the best tanks in the world. It wasn't combat, it was execution. In the final analysis, the Type 94 Tankette was a machine born from reasonable assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong, deployed in numbers that should have been spent on better equipment, used by brave men who deserved better, and maintained in service by an institution that couldn't admit its mistake. The vehicle itself was almost elegant in its simplicity, a testament to efficient design within severe constraints. The problem was that the constraints themselves were wrong. The mission was impossible, and the gap between doctrine and reality was measured in the lives of young men who had no say in the decisions that determined their fates. Today, the few surviving Type 94 Tankettes sit in museums as curiosities from a different age. Visitors look at these tiny vehicles and struggle to imagine grown men fighting in such cramped spaces, struggle to understand how something so small and lightly armed was considered a combat vehicle. The physical artifact seems almost quaint, a reminder of a more innocent age of warfare before modern tanks and precision weapons. But for the men who crewed these machines, there was nothing quaint about the experience. It was terror and duty, inadequacy and resolve, the knowledge that you were going into battle in a machine that wouldn't protect you, paired with the determination to do your duty anyway, because that's what was expected, because that's what honor demanded, because the alternative was unthinkable. The Type 94 Tankette's legacy isn't really about the vehicle itself. It's about the gap between what institutions promise and what they deliver, between the confidence of peacetime planning and the reality of combat, between what nations tell their soldiers and what those soldiers discover when theory meets enemy fire. It's about the human cost when pride and institutional inertia override practical necessity, when admitting error seems more dangerous than perpetuating failure, when maintaining face becomes more important than protecting lives. Every soldier who climbed into a Type 94 Tankette after 1939 was engaging in a kind of faith that despite what they knew about the vehicle's inadequacy, despite the evidence of previous disasters, despite the overwhelming odds, somehow they might survive, might accomplish their mission, might prove that courage and skill could overcome material deficiency. Some of that faith was rewarded. Some crews did survive, did accomplish missions, did prove that human factors matter in combat. But most found that faith was insufficient armor against high-velocity projectiles, that courage doesn't stop 50-caliber rounds, that institutional certainty is no match for enemy firepower. The story of the Type 94 Tankette is the story of thousands of young men sent to fight in inadequate equipment, told it was sufficient, dying when it proved not to be. It's the story of an institution that couldn't acknowledge error until error had killed enough people that denial was no longer possible. It's the story of the gap between what we tell soldiers and what we give them, between doctrine and reality, between confidence and delusion, and it's a story that remains relevant because the dynamics it reveals, the tension between institutional face-saving and tactical truth, between what leaders want to believe and what soldiers experience, that tension exists in every military, in every era. The Type 94 Tankette is history, a relic of a specific time and place. But the lessons it teaches about truth, honesty, and the cost of institutional pride, those lessons are timeless. Because in the end, the Tankette wasn't just a machine. It was a manifestation of human decisions, institutional priorities, cultural values, and all the ways that what seems reasonable in planning can become catastrophic in execution. And the men who died in those steel coffins deserved better than to be sacrifices to institutional certainty, better than to die proving what everyone already knew but couldn't officially acknowledge, better than to be casualties of a system that valued doctrinal consistency more than human survival.